We're ready to go. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the second meeting of our Scrutiny Review Panel on Climate Emergency. So first of all, if I can just remind people to stay muted and to keep your camera off until it is actually your chance to speak. You can indicate that you wish to speak either using the chat box or if you wish, you could put your hand up just using the raise hand function, and that would work out quite fine. Thank you. So as far as apologies for absence go, I've got Councillor Chauhan. I don't know if we've heard any more apologies for absence. No, I think that's it, just Councillor Chauhan, unfortunately. But yeah, but there you go. So right, we've got urgent matters. I've not been notified of any urgent matters, and also declarations of interest. I don't know if anyone has got a personal or prejudicial interest that they would like to declare at this point with regard to the agenda. I don't think so on that one. So I suppose I should continue to declare that I'm a trustee on the Ealing Parks Foundation. So I don't know if that would have caused any problems there, but it's probably best if I say that. In terms of matters to be considered in private, I've not been notified of any matters that need to be considered in private. So we just go on to the minutes. So I don't know if anyone's got any points to make as regard the minutes of the last meeting. Just find those minutes. Okay, so go through them. Sorry?
I said I agreed with the minute, Chair.
You do agree? Okay, so all right, we could go for page by page, but okay, so we've got by page 1 or page 2, page 3, page 4, page 5, page 6, page 7, and page 8. I think on so thank you, that's great. So the minutes are agreed. So without further ado, I'll just go on to the main items of the meeting. We're very fortunate tonight. So we've got Professor Virginia Murray, the head of Global Disaster Risk Reduction and Public Health England, with us tonight. Although she'll be leaving at 7:45, unfortunately, so we're just going to try and get through that part of the meeting as quickly as we can. Obviously, we've got Joe Mortensen, our own Climate Action Programme Manager, here to speak to us tonight as well. And we've got Maddie Gupta-Wright, the Public Health Consultant, who will be providing us with a presentation. So I think trying to think of the best way of working this out in order to ensure that Professor Murray gets a chance to speak and answer questions. Should we just go ahead with Maddie's presentation, or what would be the best way of doing this?
That's fine with me, Councillor Rice. I'm not going to be very long, and I'm certainly very keen to leave Professor Murray plenty of time to present and also discuss. So if that's okay, I'll go ahead first.
Excellent, thank you. Yes,
thanks. Good evening, everyone. And as Councillor Rice said, my name is Maddie Gupta-Wright. I'm a consultant in public health at Ealing Council. And it's my pleasure to be here this evening to present to you the report for the Scrutiny Review Panel that we submitted. Hopefully you had a chance to have a look at that. That was the Word document. I'm actually going to present a short set of slides which picks out some of the main illustrations from that document and talks you through some of the main content. But as I said, not spend a huge amount of time on my piece, because what we really want is to hear back from you all and get a discussion going, and also to leave plenty of time for our guest speaker this evening. So I'm going to turn my video off just in case of technical hitches, keep my sound on obviously, and share my screen. So can everybody see that okay?
Yes.
Thank you. Thanks very much. A lone voice in the mist. Thanks very much for that. So as I said, this was a Scrutiny Review Panel report which was titled Taking a Whole System Approach to Climate Justice and Health Equity. So that's our topic for this evening. And I really want to just start by telling you a bit about the background for this report. So the COVID pandemic, as we all know, has been an example of the unequal impact of crises upon populations and the way that inequalities are exacerbated during such times.
I think Maddie's gone.
Not quite there. Oh, yes, yeah. I wonder if it was just me. Maybe we'll just wait a moment. Hopefully she'll come back. She's still sharing her screen.
I'll message Maddie to see what's happening.
Okay, yeah.
I wonder if do you want to go to Professor Murray?
That might be an idea then, yes, in that case.
Okay, and I'll
and then
contact Maddie in the background.
Right, hopefully, because we've got a share screen situation now, so I don't know if Professor Murray needs a screen at all. But
It would be better, Councillor Rice, if I could.
okay, so I don't know how.
But I can't share a screen when Maddie's.
All right, there we go.
Okay, so you should be able to do it now.
Okay, Maddie's gone, so that's solved that problem. Thank you. So welcome, Professor Murray, whenever you're ready.
Thank you so much. Let's see if I can get it to work. Hello, my name is Virginia Murray, and it's a great honour to be invited by Maddie to come and contribute to taking a whole system approach to climate justice and health equity. To me, these are things that really matter, and I know that Maddie was very keen to share some of these thoughts with you. Now, I work mostly on a wider dimension than a local authority, so please forgive me if I don't share the things that might be most relevant to you, but I've been trying to think through what might be really helpful for your climate emergency scrutiny review panel. I've worked very much with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, particularly on managing the risks of extreme events and disasters to advance climate change adaptation. So I've been very much at that end of the work on adaptation rather than mitigation. And I've also looked at the impact of floods on health effects and their prevention, which we did jointly with the World Health Organization Regional Office for Europe. I've also got very much involved in the adaptation gap on the health report, where I was the first author for the heat and extreme events report. But only earlier this month, we published the World Meteorological Atlas of Mortality and Economic Losses from Weather, Climate and Water Extremes, which covers the last 50 years. So I've been much involved in so many of these things, and to have the opportunity to work with you who are working locally is a real privilege to me. So I just thought I'd just show you an image or two of some of the things that really frightened me. And I suspect many of you were not alive in 1976, but I was. And I remember the heat in the UK. I remember that Yorkshire ran out of water. There was huge problems with the reservoir supplies. And that's what the world looked like then when we reviewed it not long ago. But I wanted to take you to June 2018, where I have a very good image that I think explains a lot of my concerns, because that's what the world looks like now, which was really pretty shocking and really worrying to many of us. And I thank NASA so much for those images. But this type of message of how quickly our world has changed is obviously reflected very much in the IPCC report that came through in the summer in 2021, looking at the human influence on how the climate has got warmed. And we now know that we're running at an excess of 1.1 degrees C from where we would like to be looking back to 1900, 1950. So we're really concerned that we're on an upward trend that the world talks about, that we face the climate change conference in Glasgow later this year to try and consider what the impacts might be. So I thought it might be helpful to share some of the issues about protecting human health and well-being from climate change impacts that might help you to think through some of your issues. So we know that the health risks include morbidity and mortality. So morbidity being those who get affected and mortality, which is death. So we can get heat waves, storms, floods, drought, wildfires, air pollution, illnesses from food, vector and waterborne infectious diseases, and there are many others. Now, most of you in Ealing, I think, would probably have only seen the issues around heat waves, possibly some storms. I think you've got some floods because you're very close to the Thames in part. But drought does remain an issue because there's obviously concern about supplying water for the whole of London. Wildfires are not so much your problem in the middle of Ealing, but you do have some wonderful trees and woodlands that are really precious, that need to be looked after. And of course, in London, we know about the issues of air pollution, and the illnesses of food, vector and waterborne infectious diseases are something that is really of import. But the other thing that I thought would be really important just to mention is the mental health impacts, which include trauma related to extreme events, as well as the distress, anxieties, and this really difficult piece of wording to share with you, which is this feeling of disempowerment, because people don't feel they can do much about climate change, which really worries me, because we can, and that's what we need to think about. Now, if we're looking at the equity side, I thought it'd be important to share that those who have long-term chronic illnesses, such as respiratory, cardiovascular, endocrine diseases, cancer, or other illnesses, really this increases the existing health inequities in society with climate change. So it's really worrying. Those people who are unwell, who have problems, are most vulnerable. And I think that the fact that there's this report on looking at this whole system approach of looking at climate justice and human equity to look at how we manage communities is really of import. So we want communities to stay healthy in a changing climate, including delivering adaptation via planning. And I think this is really a planning meeting, Councillor Rice, that you're calling together for this strategy. But equally, we need early warning, and we need surveillance systems, and we need to know when we engage. Now, looking at some of the work from World Health Organization, it comes through very clearly that it's not just health that matters. It is this wider dimension of all the things like water and sanitation that matters so much if we're to handle climate change effectively. The concern around food, I know there's many different concerns at the moment, but food is obviously really concerning, that we should maintain our food supplies of healthy foods. And transport. Should we be encouraging public transport? Should we be looking at land use planning? And I think that's one of the areas you're very interested in considering. But also, how do you work? Should you work in the hottest part of the day outdoors? This is certainly something that's come up with many countries, but not necessarily so much in the UK yet. But housing is critical. Can we make housing really relatively climate resilient? And of course, industry and energy are all part of it. And at the heart of this is health. Now, it's not just health as you and I know it, it's the health system and the health sector as well that needs to be involved. And this was very much what the WHO Global Strategy on Health, Environment and Climate Change considers. So I thought it'd be helpful to take you into an example that we all talk about in many ways under climate change issues is extreme heat. And we know it's a silent emergency, and I'm on the executive committee of the Global Heat Health Information Network, where we try to increase the awareness and capacity to better manage and adapt to the health risks of dangerously hot weather in a changing climate. So using this to think about that driver, I thought it'd be useful to show that extreme heat and heat waves are worsening worldwide. We know this, partly because heat trapping effects of fossil fuel and other types of pollution really are very much more focused in cities, where natural landscapes have been replaced by the concrete, brick buildings and blacktop, i.e. dark surfaces. We know that trees help to reduce heat. They provide shade and they draw water up through their roots, so they release into the air to help minimize the amount of water, increase the humidity, which helps to reduce the heat impact. They also clean the air and reduce stormwater runoff. So the idea of shrubs, grasses, vegetated green roofs, community gardens and the like really provide huge benefits in heat waves. And we know that access to parks and open spaces have implications for public health beyond heat. They help to deal with some of these mental health issues by providing opportunities for exercise and relaxation that boost physical and mental health. Now, the built environment is really a very considerable interest, and I find this image really quite interesting, and I'll explain it to you a little bit. It's strategic and environmental sustainable and urban development, which really needs to consider future climate impacts, particularly as the temperature rises. And then there's this need for technical and biophysical materials and design in housing, roads and green spaces. So the idea of painting roads white is something that's come through very strongly from other countries. Whether we need that in Ealing, I don't know yet, but it would be very interesting to hear your thoughts on that. And indeed, after the terrible heat dome that happened over Canada and indeed over the northeast of the United States, the United Nations FCCC, who work for climate change, put out a blog on resilience called Too Hot to Handle, and they included something that I thought might be a useful trigger for your reflections today. They suggested that individuals asked your local government to open and make provision for cooling centres. I don't know if you have them in Ealing. Increase the green spaces. I know you do, and you have some lovely parks. But to make water much more accessible in urban planning, absorbing the heat. You may want to include ecosystem restoration and protection wherever you can. Consider encouraging green roofs or even painting roofs white if you can't necessarily paint the roads white. Changing the opening hours of shops so that perhaps people don't have to go to the shops in the hottest hours, and perhaps make public transport cheaper or even free during heat waves to restrict the use of cars. There are ideas like this that might be of help for you to reflect on. Now, there's been a huge amount of work that's including a couple of papers very recently published in The Lancet, and one of them by Ollie J includes the community health heat action plan elements and preventive actions to reduce heat-related health risks. And you can see there's a very strong link between health sector leadership and partner engagement to integrated surveillance and early warning, so important. But we do have very close links with Public Health England and the Met Office to make sure we can provide early warning, but also a community response plan, and then climate resilient health systems. But throughout all this, we need communications and education and longer term preventive measures to finally support some of these sustainable cooling strategies in landscape and urban buildings and individuals, to look particularly at aged care homes, workplaces, schools, sports and mass gatherings, places that we have particularly, although this was a global article of great relevance to many others around the world. Now, what we do have in Public Health England is something that I had for a while the privilege of being responsible for, which is the Heatwave Plan for England. And the Heatwave Plan for England, when I was the head of extreme events and health protection in the early, between 2011 to 2014, we had this plan that was really, this aim was to raise public awareness of the dangers of excessive heat, linking to ensure that health, social care and other voluntary and community organisations and the wider civic society really try to deal with the issues about heat waves, but particularly to protect the most vulnerable. And that was a huge learning curve. For instance, one of the issues we found was that we hadn't warned schools, perhaps to change the time of school sports days in a heat wave. So that was something that really worried us when we got some of the data back. So we have things that posters that we try and provide about beat the heat. This was something we've done specifically for COVID-19, where we've been trying to give guidance about stay cool at home, stay cool, keep well, cooler, safer places, and watch out for various things. So that's what you can do for yourself. And that might be something you might want to encourage, particularly in Ealing with your public health links. But the other one is to beat the heat, where you try and keep the residents in care homes safer. Again, reflecting the COVID-19 issues, but also looking at those who are higher risk, keeping residents cool, keeping the building cool, and when to take action. So these are the sorts of things that have been used. And when you consider that you're taking a whole system approach to climate justice and health equity, looking at climate change, I hope these are a few useful thoughts when you discuss the paper that has been presented to you by Maddie. So these are a few sources of information that I thought might be useful, and I will of course share these slides with Maddie for all of you. I hope that is of help. Many thanks for inviting me to contribute, Councillor Rice. And I'll now start my video just so you know I'm really human.
All right. Well, thank you very much, Professor Murray. I must admit, I was alive in 1976, but I was only 2, so I can't remember the heat wave. But maybe I was blessed by not actually remembering such severe circumstances. I must say that presentation has actually left me quite moved. It does make you really think about the dreadful consequences of our actions on the earth and what might happen in the future. So, so please, can I just invite anybody who'd like to ask questions of Professor Murray? Thank you. Oh, Councillor Driscoll, please.
Thanks, Professor Murray. Yeah, I think you've brought quite a wide range of issues, some of which I think I can give some good feedback on. I think we've done well on, like urban heating. I think Ealing has got a good, strong record on tree planting in an urban setting, not just in parks, so that's really great. But given that we're looking at the equalities issues, what I'd be really interested in, and I know the tree service probably have this, is looking where we have those trees planted. I think my ward is particularly leafy with street trees, but I think looking at other areas and others, and Ealing has quite a disparity of income in different areas, and to make sure that we're balancing and distributing that planting. I'd be interested also understanding like the responsibility and links with like the CQC and their role with the monitoring of elder care in homes and healthcare settings. And I wonder, in terms of private healthcare settings for residential care, how many are actually well adapted and prepared for excessive heat, because it tends to arrive very quickly without great planning and by its very nature. I'd be interested from us on a council side, which we don't have that many sort of care homes really, but sheltered housing we do have, which is different from a care setting, but we do have that duty of care to see to make sure our residents who are able and living independently, what have we got in preparation for excessive heat in those settings. And I think the safety at work, I think there's like an overlap with health and safety executive, where we don't have a statutory duty. However, we can be like an instrument for setting the overall theme or climate, or encouraging and nudging. So there's like a lot of bit of a web of different agencies with different statutory duties, and the council has a geographical location, but doesn't always have that statutory duty and responsibility in some areas. So I'd be interesting if you've got any feedback about how those links, and I know those links exist, but how they might have good practice links that might have been done elsewhere, that would be helpful to hear about, and maybe to feed in with Ealing's work. So, I mean, I've got some other points, but I'll just leave with those couple at the moment. Thanks.
Would you like me to reply now, Councillor Rice?
Please, yeah.
Okay, Councillor Driscoll, you've brought up some wonderful comments. Huge thanks to you. I'm so glad to hear that you do have a very active tree planting campaign. This is something that's invaluable, but it's also the maintenance of the trees and the management of them that remains so important. And of course, the pavements and everything around it. So the trees have many benefits, but also they're not something that you can just leave and let them get on with it. I'm very pleased you've identified that care homes are, although you have few of them, are not so much an issue for you, but they may be something that you'd be very interested to know more. CQC are involved, I believe, in the heat wave plan engagement and getting the delivery for it. I've been working on, I haven't worked with our Public Health England Extreme Events team since 2014 because I've been doing this global work. So please forgive me that I can't give you a specific answer, but I'm sure that Maddie, when she comes online, would be able to do much more for you on that. Private healthcare or healthcare for the vulnerable is something that I've tried to share with you, some of the issues that we are really concerned with. So I know that our Public Health England Heatwave plan does include a lot of easy read and other resources, and quite a lot of it's been translated into other languages. But it is actually providing the information for people as they need it and when they need it. So if I could turn it round to you in another way, Councillor Driscoll, do you have in your ward cooling spaces for people to go to where it's really hot? We know that there's been some work, perhaps in schools or maybe in cinemas or all sorts of other places where there are cooling facilities, maybe in the libraries, that might be able to help. Safety at work, I recognise, is not your issue, but you may have staff who are working in the heat, and you might want to recommend that they take more breaks if it gets particularly hot. that might be something you might want to consider as just as an issue for them. And I'm very grateful for all your thinking about all these duties. And what I tried to show you from the WHO thinking is that it's all this put together into a whole picture that helps to explain some of the issues that we need to consider. And it's by working in partnership with these other organizations that I think then you'll find it much more effective to try and look at how we can look after the most vulnerable in the different types of issues, from heat waves to air pollution to floods to all the problems that I tried to summarize briefly for you. Thank you. Councillor Driscoll.
Thank you.
Thank you. So can I invite Councillor Burke, please?
Yeah, thank you very much for that presentation. I just wondered, I do appreciate you've been working globally, but in terms of one of the things that sometimes happens in councils is we work a little bit in silos. And I wondered if you could give us any advice or guidance in terms of what we should be thinking about when we're, I'm also on the planning committee. So what are the kind of things that we should be including in our planning guidance? I'm thinking about floodplains, I'm thinking about the nature of building materials. I could go on and on and on and on, but because at the moment it's a kind of little box at the end. I just wondered if you've got any examples of where councils or other organisations are much more rigorous about this.
So I think depending on where you are, I think the most important thing is obviously to try and reduce the risk of building on floodplains. That to me is something that we know. We live in a very watery country, and floodplains are very hard to contain and control. The trouble is we have an increasing population. How is it possible to manage it? I fully understand the needs that you must face. But to me, the more restrictions we can put on floodplain building, in my view, would be really helpful. There's been some very interesting work done in New York, which is not very applicable for you, but they have been building banks around their island to be able to hold water. Now, that's a pretty dramatic way of trying to manage water when there's a real problem. So all their underground roads and places they could fill with water if they needed to, if the sea level rose too much. But that may be something that we might need to think about, particularly if we had problems with our wonderful Thames barrier, when I hope to goodness we don't have. But it's been quite close to overtopping. But the Thames barrier to me was an incredibly far-sighted investment, really from the 1960s onwards, because it took a long time to build. So for you to be aware of where the risk of the floodplains are would be really important, and to think about it. The other thing that I think is really coming through very strongly is this idea of green walls, but also trying to do reflective heating, reflective panels to try and reduce the absorption of heat, but also to keep heat in. So there's been a lot of work that's been done on research to try and show that if you might want shutters or blinds to close the windows to keep the sun out, but also to keep heat in the winter. All these different techniques are things that should be considered. And if that could be included in your planning thinking, I think that would be really exciting, Councillor Burke. This is not possibly the time to take you through all of that, but there's some really incredible work that I've seen going on.
Thank you. So if I can invite Councillor Dabrowska, please.
Thank you, Professor Murray. It's been, I have to say, very interesting presentation. I'm sure it's a topic that you can go on and on for hours, exploring various avenues. Picking up on previous questions and my thoughts with regards to sort of changing for the future, because ultimately we have to change for the future. There's obviously the national policy side and actions, and there's the individual actions. And taking up on, for example, what you mentioned about painting, for example, roads white or buildings white. I still live in Spain on an island, and I suppose growing up with white painted buildings was absolutely normal. So what practice can the country and maybe, for example, the construction industry take from, say, the hotter countries that are sort of closer to the equator? What do they do to keep cool? Because they naturally have found over the centuries a good method, and there's no point in reinventing the wheel. And I suppose for the individual side, what would be interesting is, as well as the council side, you mentioned about a lot of green spaces, like Councillor Driscoll. I'm very sort of, I've been planting trees in my ward through my 15 years as a councillor. I've been trying to push as many as possible, but there is a fashion now to change things into meadows, for example. But I feel that meadows are absorbing too much moisture in the air and making the air dry. So has there been any studies done what sort of, for example, plants that individuals can plant to make the moisture in the air stay there rather than absorb it too much? I'm thinking really sort of blue sky thinking.
Councillor Dabrowska, you've stretched the limits of my knowledge. I'm not very good on the plant side.
Never mind,
even,
I'm asking.
Even if Chelsea Flower Show is on. I mean, there's a lot of thinking about this, and I think there is research. I mean, obviously, we're also very concerned about keeping biodiversity, which is absolutely vital. So I love your comments about living somewhere hot. And we did a lot of work looking at the warm countries and seeing how they managed and looking at the things. And remember, I'm not an architect. I'm just somebody who's very curious. So I'm going to try and share with you a few thoughts. There are some incredible wind cooling systems that I've seen in some of the Middle Eastern cities, which I think is a really interesting model, and where you bring in cooler air into town and into your place of work or whatever to try and cool things. So we don't use air conditioning, because air conditioning, of course, uses a lot of electricity, and electricity is something we have to generate. And if in the process of generation, you can obviously increase the risk of long-term climate change issues. So I think those are really interesting models. But when we looked at the southern cities, as you describe in Europe, where they cope better with heat, we also found that they didn't cope as well with cold. So when we did a review across Europe of all the different impacts, we found that it was really important to try and build these more sustainable housing that that Councillor Burke was suggesting, and I think would be really helpful to try and make sure you make housing fit for all extremes. I think what climate change is doing, which might be a helpful image for you, is that we know we've had rain, we know we've had floods, we know we've had cold, we know we've had wind, but what's happening with climate change is this pendulum is swinging just that much faster, and we can't predict quite when it's going to change so fast. So the speed at which things are happening is changing, and that's what I really wanted to try and share with you in a way that we haven't quite learnt the science to understand all of that yet, which is why early warning is so important wherever we can, and where the forward look, the 3-monthly forward look that the UK Met Office provides us with and things like that are really important. But what you need it for is for your very own local wards. It's back to your local communities that really matter, and for your local communities to be able to look after each other, which is one of the things COVID has shown us, is that societal transformation is what we hope will happen a little bit when we really have to, when we know that we're dealing with climate change. Because the real problem we have now with climate change is there is no vaccination. It is something we're going to have to do together for resilience, all of us. And I think looking at the most vulnerable are the ones that we really need to look after the best, to make sure they understand what the risks are, but also understand all the language we use and make sure it's available in as many languages that they need locally to understand what the problems might be. Does that help at all, Councillor Dabrowska?
Thank you. No, it's giving me sort of looking at the two extremes. And just to add, I used to live in -25 temperatures as well. So I totally understand the swings and extremes of being prepared, and we have to adapt. And being an island here, we're quite damp. So there's another angle. Thank you.
Thank you.
Chair, can I chip in for very quickly one of the question, please?
Okay. Oh yes, thank you, Councillor Mahmood, yes, please.
Yeah. Thank you, Professor Murray. It's a very informative presentation. And in terms of our planning committee member, like Councillor Burke said, we are thinking how we could make our plan for future housing and future housing infrastructure and structure for climate change friendly. You mentioned the white roads and that sort of things. Could you just give me any example here in UK where they are adopting that sort of thingy in terms of wide road or other stuff which is unusual? Thank you.
Well, Councillor Mahmood, I'm not an expert on these things, so please forgive me. This is not, but I'll try and help. So, for instance, in my own home, which has a flat roof, I've painted it with a silver reflective material, so we try and keep the heat out. So that's something I can do personally. It may be something you might want to do for any flat roofs, is to encourage the use of reflective materials on top of roofs when they're maintained. We certainly used drones at one point to see how good insulation was in people's homes in the roofs, and we could spot where people lost a lot of heat in the winter, because we were also running the cold weather plan. So there may be ways of trying to understand where you could invest usefully to try and deal with trying to increase the insulation, but also increase the reflection from above. So that might be useful. But what I wanted to reflect to you was that we had one problem with the heat wave, when I was working as head of the extreme events team, where we found that the temperature inside a ground floor flat was infinitely higher than we ever expected because of the reflection from the tarmac straight into the windows. It really heated up this person's flat and made them extremely hot and unwell. And we were very worried about that. So we've had long discussions about trying to increase greenery around people's homes where you're building new flats, but also they're trying to produce more lighter covering stonework or whatever you wanted to use for pavements to try and prevent so much reflection into people's homes. And that was something that's also been found in healthcare facilities. So there's things like that, but I'm not the expert on this. I'm only a health professional. But I just wanted to share with you some of these ideas about how we reduce vulnerability. And I'm sure you will have colleagues who might be able to help much better than I can. But it was just trying to give you a flavour because Dr. Gupta Wright thought it might be useful. Many thanks.
Thank you. And so Councillor Driscoll again, please.
Thanks. Just to help with that discussion about what's happening with individuals in their homes. I did have another point as well for Professor Murray. There's a long-standing project called Green Doctors, which does go to individual homes, especially those on low income, and looks at insulation. I don't think it tends to be towards heat retention rather than cooling. And I think this part of climate change, we tend to forget about excessive heat very often. And everything's about, we're on about preserving or not using energy, which is absolutely fine and that absolutely has got merits. But there is a long-standing project looking specifically about insulation, draft proofing, and it does target low-income households as well. So there's a good news story there. Less about painting roads white, but there, and that sort of that level that does exist, and the council's building programme is ramping up in terms of insulation, and but we tend to talk more about insulation rather than cooling. So it's kind of interesting hearing this is another aspect of climate change, the sort of extremes of climate that we may be going to experience, rather than looking at just preserving heat and not using as much energy to generate heat. We should also be looking at and not lose sight of that excessive heat. But one thing, to go back to your presentation, was about disempowerment, given that the theme of this session is about justice and making sure that people can participate. I think that's really interesting about disempowerment, because we're talking about global change, transnational, transcontinental change, but often has very local consequences. And my own ward had flooding because of dramatic, immense downpours of water very swiftly. And that could be exacerbated coming further. But understanding how that communication with people to encourage that they have a role to play, and some of that role might be very small and might be improving what seem very small amounts of insulation and draft proofing in their home to reduce heat demand, reduce energy, which will then go through to the national grid on a macro level as they all come together as a bigger sum. But I wonder how other places, countries have actually approached that. I know there's certain projects in Ealing going on, but it's just interesting if you've got any experiences to share with us about that, encouraging empowerment to feel that there is something that can be done. That would be really helpful to understand. Thank you.
So, Councillor Driscoll, you're asking a question that I think is a tremendously vital one. There is, so I've been working with the European community on a mission for climate change adaptation with societal transformation. There are 15 of us, and I represent health on this community. And we have been looking at all the different processes and programs and how to deliver it. We are hopefully going to put out funding from that particular project, which sadly will not come to us, but we will be able to observe from others what they do to try and see what might work well and what might not work so well. But to me, this idea of societal transformation is really important, about behavioural change is absolutely critical. But I really wanted to share with you that this is really a very forward-looking programme which the European Commission are running, and I think it's a vital one that will hopefully be shared well at the climate change conference, the COP26. Although we know that most of the adaptation and resilience part of the conference, which is one of the main themes, one of the main pillars this time, may not address it fully, but it's a start. So, Councillor Driscoll, we may not have all the answers for you yet, but you ask for something that is needed. And that's what we've been working on, to try and see what is needed. And I would be happy to share through Dr. Gupta-Wright some of the resources, if that would be helpful, for some of that work.
Yes, thank you. Thank you.
Okay, thank you then. So I don't know if there are any more questions, but it's actually interesting, Professor Murray, that you mentioned about increasing access to water and good drinking water. I mean, I mentioned earlier about being involved with the Ealing Parks Foundation, because of course there's been cutbacks in government funding. It's forcing councils to have to think out the box a little bit in order to run our parks and green spaces properly. So other areas such as Bristol have formed park foundations. So it just means bringing the community together and bringing ideas forward in order to do those extra things on top of the council statutory responsibilities, in order to make sure that our parks become, very appealing places that actually address matters such as mental health issues, such as education when it comes to biodiversity, when it comes to general physical fitness as well. And so it's one of the things that we've been looking at where there's grant money available in order to actually have proper water fountains in parks. And so sometimes the designs aren't necessarily that appealing. They're not quite as ornate as you might like, but it's something that people certainly are working on. So yes, so I mean, it's just something that hopefully, I mean, since we've got word from people such as yourself actually just giving us these ideas, that I just hope that you've got what it takes in order to encourage, let's say, the funding to come wherever it's going to come from, in order that we can have these developments in our parks.
Well, I think it's changing our way of thinking, Councillor Rice. That's the incredible thing that we've got to face now, and seeing how we can bring our societal transformation into something that is acceptable and accepted and done. It's got to be useful, usable and used, and we've got to change how we think, and it's through education at all levels and many things, but particularly looking after the most vulnerable will be really critical. Councillor Rice, will you forgive me if I disappear now, because it is the time I have to go, if that's all right. But I see that Dr. Gupta-Wright is back, so I know she will take it forward. And I'm very grateful to Maddie for inviting me, and I hope I've provided you with a little more thinking, and I will share my talk with her so that she can share it with you as well.
Thank you so much. It's just been absolutely just wonderful just having you here tonight. I think you've really put us on the right track of what we need to be doing here, and so you're going to do us, so it's bring us so much benefit to us here at the council, at the Ealing Council. So.
It's a great privilege. Many thanks to you all for your patience.
Lovely
Very
evening.
good of you. Thank you.
Thank you. Bye bye. Right. So Maddie is back. So Maddie, as best you can, would you like to perhaps try again with the presentation? It's a shame that we lost you there, but here you're back now, so that's fantastic.
Yeah, thank you so much, Councillor Rice, and apologies to everyone for that hiccup. It was great to catch most of Professor Murray's discussion and presentation, and I'm really glad that everybody felt they benefited from that. She's an inspiration for sure, and we'll have those connections and those links to share with you, as she mentioned. So my colleague Jo is sharing the screen just in case I have another technical hitch, but hopefully you can all hear me okay. I'm going to start again. So my bit was really just to bring to this meeting a summary of the Word document report that we've shared in advance, and hopefully you've all had a chance to read. But it really is about that focus on climate justice and health equity, and proposing that we're going to be taking a report to Cabinet later on in the year. So this is an opportunity to also use your feedback and the discussions this evening to kind of shape some recommendations for that. So Joe, if you can move to the first slide, thank you. So the background of the report was sort of contextualised by the COVID pandemic. It's been an example of an unequal impact of a crisis upon a population, and it's shown that in crises, inequalities really do get exacerbated. Similar patterns of that inequality can be expected from crises that emerge from the climate crisis. And whilst negative health impacts of climate change and potential health co-benefits of climate action are well documented for everyone, neither are equitably distributed. So some will always be more disproportionately affected or disadvantaged. In other words, the same populations that are currently affected by those health and social and economic inequalities are more likely to experience the worst impacts from climate change, and equally face more barriers to positive change to contribute to climate action. Now, in Ealing, we often understand those health, social and economic inequalities to be distinctly geographically distributed, and that's where this map is helpful. It shows the indices of multiple deprivation for Ealing areas from 2019. We also, though, understand complex inequalities to occur by ethnicity, of course, and other demographic and social and political elements of context. So particularly thinking about kind of discrimination as a whole, rather than just the economic position of individuals. Preparations for potential future crises need to prioritise the tackling of inequality in society, the building of equity and fairness, and more sustainably into the current recovery from the pandemic and the way that we move forward from the pandemic, so that we can be assured that resilience could be shared by everybody. And also it needs to prioritise justice in all action on the climate and ecological crisis, which is really the argument that we're making with the information presented in the report. So critically, the report itself is by identifying both the co-benefits of climate action for health and the health inequality risks of climate change, and also certain approaches to climate action, we reveal the need for a whole systems way of working on climate justice and health equity. And as I said, this topic is going to form the basis of a Cabinet report for later on in the year, where recommendations for whole system working will be made. And we'd very much welcome your feedback this evening so that we can help shape some of those recommendations going forward. So this slide on screen now is one that's in the second section of the report, which highlights the body of evidence making the links between climate change and public health. And you've heard from Professor Murray, where she's made that argument very clearly with other sources as well this evening. Recognising that really climate change is one of the greatest public health challenges, and we think of it as an opportunity of this century as well, because of course there is an opportunity to really turn this around and ensure that we embed public health and health equity principles into climate action. This diagram from the Met Office illustrates the wide range of impacts that are occurring and expected to occur from the changes to the climate system due to those man-made drivers that are in the middle of the circle. So the outer circle is really the impacts that you expect to see. Some of those have been very well described by Professor Murray. Some of the most important health harms from climate change are described in our report. So the first example is that exposure to increasing heat, which results in excess death in the population through various means. And to an even greater degree, exposure to cold weather, particularly in the home, which can be expected to cost the NHS something in the order of £2.5 billion per year. And the main inequality and impact from both extremes of temperature is affecting older people. So already those who are vulnerable from greater incidence of long-term conditions and frailty. The report also describes the health impacts of outdoor and indoor air pollution, including the ground level ozone pollution and aeroallergens, which will disproportionately affect those already suffering from long-term respiratory conditions. And it describes the profound health effects from floods and droughts, which are also well documented, particularly the mental health impacts of flooding and the increased greater incidence of vector-borne infectious diseases. There is also the impact of climate change on the availability of food groups, and this may lead to reductions in the nutritional quality of dietary intake for some population groups rather than others, another significant exacerbating factor for pre-existing inequalities. And there are huge inequalities in terms of being able to mitigate against these effects of climate change. So, for example, deprivation affecting the quality of a home a person lives in, the proximity to poorer air pollution due to living nearest to the busiest roads, and people's ability to make home adjustments which would protect them against those extreme and hot and cold weathers. Next slide, please, Jo. So as well as those negative impacts on health, which might feel more direct, there are many other related to loss of biodiversity, reduced productivity of some industries, and the profound effects of societal changes such as mass migration, violent conflict, and extreme poverty. And of course, all of those slightly more indirect impacts have a then cyclical direct impact on poorer health. These are well illustrated and they're circled in black on this diagram, which was from a Lancet paper in 2015. Next slide, please. And there are also many positive health gains that could be made from taking climate action if we do it through the lens of inequality, of tackling inequality. So the health protection agencies, now Public Health England, report in 2012 acknowledged the array of health co-benefits from measures to reduce greenhouse gas emissions, including a decline in air pollution, which can impact improved respiratory health, an increased physical activity as a result of reduced car use in urban centres, and health benefits from reduced dietary saturated fat consumption from animal products. In addition, interventions such as car sharing can improve well-being through increased social interaction, and those living closer to green space in urban areas have been found to experience lower rates of anxiety. All these health co-benefits work through several causal pathways via what we call the social and environmental determinants of health. And they're well summarised by Ashton, Climate Solutions in Action, which is a not-for-profit organisation whose mission is to accelerate transformative climate solutions. However, many of the co-benefits, examples of which are seen in the middle column of this diagram, are also inequitably distributed in the population, unless the action to decarbonise on the far left has occurred through the lens of inequality originally, and schemes have been distributed appropriately, which means really targeting those most in need first and at a greater intensity than the universal population. And we call that, that whole concept is known as proportionate universalism. So the importance of reducing inequities whilst mitigating climate change is crucial for promoting population and system health resilience. And this means fair, equitable access to clean air, safe and energy efficient homes, food security, resilient and accessible health systems, and reductions in social and economic inequity to enable a more even participation in active climate citizenship. Next slide, please, Jo. So just in summary, the report really shows that whilst the negative health impacts of climate change and the positive and the potential health co-benefits of climate action are well documented for everyone, neither are equitably distributed. And these same populations that are currently affected by the worst health and social and economic inequalities, also made worse by the COVID pandemic, will be more likely to experience the worst impacts from climate change and equally face disproportionate barriers to positive change to contribute to climate action. And there's a huge body of evidence described, some of which is described in the report, to describe that interconnection between climate crisis and worsening health inequalities. As such, action taken to mitigate the impact of the climate crisis needs to be developed through that lens of justice and equity in Ealing, and requires us to work as a whole system. And the opportunities for that sustainable change are far greater when components of the system have those shared aims and can bring their influence and levers for change to bear on a shared cross-system issue. So, as I mentioned earlier, there's work to inform a cabinet paper to make recommendations to the council for such a whole system approach to these two important issues, and that's about to commence. And opportunities to embed a collaborative approach to climate justice and health equity are several. So we really do have a great opportunity here. I just welcome all the feedback and discussion from the scrutiny panel this evening to help us shape some of those recommendations going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much. So does anyone want to start with those suggestions and recommendations for us to work on? Anyone? All right, lovely. Councillor Driscoll, please.
Thanks for the presentation, and thanks for highlighting a lot of the inequalities in the borough, because I think it's really important that we recognise Ealing has some significant disparity in income, health outcomes across the borough. So I think that's really important to think about how those different groups, either geographically in the borough, ethnic groups, are going to be impacted. And often there's a very strong economic link between all of that. And I'm just wondering, I mean, I raised it previously about that empowerment and disenfranchisement, about how are we communicating so that small steps can be seen as valid and be useful. So what steps are we taking for that? And I think I could think of some examples, like there's the cycling hub in Southall, which has been really interesting to see how that works, but it's a very small scale. But how are we moving that forward, and how are we making sure that those options are available in a wider range? Because we've got a pilot that looks really good, but how can we actually make that go forward? And I know there's Let's Go Southall, so there is work going on, and there is active projects, which is great. And people do often think that that is a climate response as well, but the issue of excessive heat and health very much related. So just trying to get people to be engaged, and how we're communicating that would be really helpful to understand what actions we're taking locally. Thank you.
Thanks, Councillor Driscoll. I'm not sure I'm going to be able to tell you what's happening right now locally on that issue, but I absolutely agree with you about the whole topic of empowerment and confidence building of different community groups to be able to kind of do what is within their power, and also reach out and access resources in order to do more, which hasn't previously been within the scope. So I think we can think about the recommendations in that light, and how we connect with sort of broader community engagement and communication, sort of strategic approach of us as a whole system, and working with health partners, think about that more broadly. Joe, on the line, I don't know if you've got anything to add from the climate ecological emergency strategy discussions around sort of topic of empowerment and communication, and whether there's anything at the moment that you could highlight.
Yeah, well, so right now we're working with, as you may recall, we've launched, we've sort of been a partner in launching Act for Ealing, which is a climate action hub, which invites local organizations to sort of come together and share what they're doing in terms of addressing the climate and ecological emergency, and sort of what climate action looks like on a local level. And one of the big sort of pushes of that group is to make sure that new organization reflects the whole of Ealing, because it's very easy to sort of get in a world of where we're just working with the partners that we know, for instance, or we're not sort of reaching out into the corners of the community that might not be as visible, or on the social media, etc. So one of the things that we're working with in that group is to make sure that we're expanding that and showing people all of the connections to climate action. And I think that's going to move into a real discussion of equity and empowering people to help one another. And I think hopefully we can build on the sort of the mutual aid that we saw come forward during the COVID pandemic, like during the heart of the pandemic, and people really wanting to help one another and spread those messages and rally around something that was meaningful to them. And we can see, I hope we can catalyze that for climate action as well. I really liked what Professor Murray said, that there is no vaccine for climate change. I thought that was a really interesting thing. So I'll be really interested to see as we begin, as we start to really work with the community on these issues of addressing climate change, sort of what their individual and unique responses are and what they think needs to happen and can happen within their community, and what motivates individual communities within Ealing.
Thank you.
Councillor Burke, please.
Just a couple of comments. A couple of comments really. One is really about, it's a bit the same comment as I made before about how we really make sure that in something like this that we really link this to other strategies that are going on within the council. And again, the local plan is one that comes to mind, given we've got the meeting next week. And actually, having looked at that agenda, there really isn't very much that says much about this. And if we're going to address inequalities, that's a great place to start. And the second one is in terms of the health stuff, with the creation of the ICPs, etc. I mean, that's a real opportunity. And I know you mentioned that. And again, through different roles, I'm involved in that. And to be fair, with COVID, they're slightly distracted, but there hasn't really been a mention of any of this either. And then my third point, sorry to sort of say three things all at once, is just I do like the recommendations, but I wonder if you could be a bit harder on us, because there's something there really about kind of pinning us down to some outcomes or some really, forgive the pun, some concrete actions. That's my only worry, is how we as a council and us as councillors are properly held to account on this. Sorry, there was a lot in that. If you want me to repeat any of it, I'm quite happy to.
That's great. Thanks, Councillor Burke. You've referenced two areas of whole systems working that are absolutely the sort of way that we want to go, the local plan and the ICP development and their priorities. So absolutely, these are, I think, the kinds of spaces that we want to make some recommendations for whole systems working in and on. And just to your third point, I guess, briefly, before I go back to that a little, on the concrete action. So the report that will be going to Cabinet, the intention with that is that we have some concrete recommendations and then some kind of actions will come from that, and that will happen later on in the year. So yes, this is very much the start of gathering together the context and background information that will inform that Cabinet report and that process. But I'm mindful that we do need the whole systems recommendations, although they'll be big and whole systems and might feel kind of grey because of the nature of whole systems working. We need some tangible kind of actions and discrete recommendations within that. So one bit of the ICP, I guess, creation and opportunity within that whole kind of work is that there's a subgroup of the ICP which looks specifically at population health and health inequalities, and that's chaired by Anna Bryden, Director of Public Health. And we've been having discussions about this very topic and health equity and climate justice, kind of feeding into that work stream and ensuring that it is part of what the ICP look at and do and take responsibility for. And I mean that as the council, as part of the ICP, of course. We're not outside that. We're a fundamental big player in that. So really, thanks very much for your comments. It's great to sort of hear that feedback, and that reinforces that we're on the right tracks with our thinking, actually, because you're making some very sensible and some great kind of ideas for recommendations back to us, which we can take forward.
Can I come back, Miriam, if it's okay? Just
to
say, the only thing I'm worried about with it being later, and again, I totally get that you're all really busy, is we've got the first of this year's of the local plan meetings next week, and they're all quite quickly coming together. And it does slightly worry me that we could get about halfway through this and then suddenly it's, here And if I look at our climate strategy, which Joe very kindly went through with me a little while back, there are some really good, strong, concrete outcomes in that. So I don't think it would take a lot of, well, you know, a lot of work. It's easy to say when you're not doing it, but I don't think it's a big stretch to say, well, actually, some of the things around metropolitan open land, around our building materials, around gardens, etc., which are very much around the whole thing, address the inequalities and air quality, etc. I just wondered if we could lift some of them and say, well, how do they work for our local plan? I mean, very happy to pursue this outside of the meeting, but
no, absolutely. Totally agree with you. Joe and I are both involved from an officer perspective in the local plan development. We'll be doing our bit to raise these issues and to bring some of that thinking into those discussions. So, yeah, very rest assured that we're very mindful of the local plan development. Joe, I don't know whether you want to come in on the local plan and your involvement in those, but just, I guess, just from my side, whilst I'm actually about to go on maternity leave and my replacement's coming in, it's one of the things I'm handing over to them to take forward is our public health and health equity and climate justice input to the local plan.
Yeah, Maddie, I guess all I would say is just to sort of reiterate or sort of reinforce what you said is that both of us are at that table. We've heard from the lead, Steve Barton, who's leading on the development of climate, of the local plan, and Connor McDonough, who's on this call as well tonight, who leads our service. The health and climate action are at the heart of the new local plan. They're two of the three strands that they're kind of framing up the whole local plan around. So I would expect that we will see these tie up really well together. And as we move into sort of looking at, it's hard to believe, but we look at refreshing the climate strategy, because it, in a couple of years, we'll be through the action planning, sort of first iteration of our action planning. So we'll go back and do a refresh. Maddie and I have talked about making sure that we tie the climate strategy even tighter to these health and inequalities sides of things, to make sure that we're really bringing that forward alongside the engagement stuff as well. So I think we've got lots of advocates and good minds working on it, and I think as far as I'm concerned, we're at this stage where we could use really good ideas from the community and from leadership as well, just so that we make sure that we've got support for the things that are being proposed.
Thank you. So I mean, there's one thing that I could probably just ask about, is that we're very concerned about how do we really get a lot more buy-in from people, a lot more understanding of the issues, because one of the things that occurred to me right now, it's Zero Emission Day today. It's the Great Big Green Week this week. It's Recycle Week this week. Tomorrow will be World Car Free Day. So hopefully people will be encouraging people to just leave their cars at home. And so we talk a lot about this, and we tell people that that really they should be acting on these initiatives. But it's a case of, do they really understand all the issues behind it, the things that we've been discussing here? Is there more that we can do in order to make people fully aware of the real consequences of their actions? That's probably what we need to do. It just I didn't actually watch the programmes, but I think it was the programmes about plastics by with Attenborough, that really seemed to very much change people's mindset when they really actually had to focus on particular matters. And so I'm just hoping that there's more that we can do as a council, actually, to really push it in people's faces, as it were, and to really say, but these are the issues. You care about your NHS, you've been clapping for carers, you've been doing all that. Well, if you want to really care about your NHS, then just let's have a healthier population. Let's actually do something about the air quality. I mean, I do think back to that we did have an air quality scrutiny panel a couple of years ago. I wasn't actually on that panel, but I did at one point get the chance to speak as a witness on the issue of the impacts of bonfires and spoke from that, because I just had a few things to say on that. But it's just something that we just need to continue to work with, and to remember just how dangerous it is. I mean, even dementia, which it just completely blows my mind to think of how many issues how many health problems and health issues can be caused by these pollution that people don't really realise. And of course, we think that we care about the world. Well, surely there's more that we can do to show that we care about people in other countries who are going to be affected by climate change. And it's not just some distant nation, somewhere far away, not to worry about. I mean, so I certainly know my auntie, who's very seriously ill in Oregon. I mean, she was having to endure those 50-degree temperatures a little while ago. I've also got my other auntie in Germany, who just down the road from her had to see the floods going on. I mean, climate change is real. It's hitting us. It's hitting the West, and it's not just somewhere far away that we just forget about. It's somewhere close to us, close to home. And so I just really hope that there's a lot that we can do to really make sure people realise that, because we are going to have to make changes in our lifestyles. We are going to have to leave our cars at home. These are the things that we can do. I mean, we can change our diet as well. I mean, I can certainly recommend that if we could perhaps think a bit more of that. But although I know that was very much part of last year's climate emergency panels, we don't necessarily want to dwell too much on the food side. But if I can just say thank you very much, Maddie, and it was a really excellent presentation, just very helpful. And also thank you very much to Joe for your inputs as well on that, and to Connor for turning up as well, just to hear what we have to say. So that's been excellent. Thank you. So if I can just move on, please. Right, so we have got our final guest for tonight. We've got Marie Noel-View has arrived, the consultant in public health from Lambeth Council. And and it really is an honour to have you here, because I'm a great admirer of what you've been achieving in Lambeth. Yes, I mean, just you've got a fantastic council lead there in Clare Holland, and it's just you've been doing some great things, and so it'd be great to hear from you. So please do fire away.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you very much, Councillor Miriam Wright, for the opening, if we can say. And thank you to Maddie for discussing the challenge of climate change and justice. So I will share very quickly some slides, and it was for me an opportunity to brainstorm a bit, reflecting a bit on what we did some time ago now, because with COVID, we haven't. So I have to understand if I'm sharing. I don't think I am.
Not yet.
Well, sorry. Yes, now I will be sharing that, I think. Right. Can you see that? Yeah?
Yes.
Perfect.
Yeah.
Okay. So thank you for inviting me. I think when I discussed with Maggie about climate change and justice, I understood that there were 2 points that maybe we could share with you. And these are just sharing. We are not perfect, but maybe there is something we can exchange. Just listening the last 5 minutes, I learned a lot. And some of your project intervention and e-living are of interest for us, I think, to look at further. So the first question that I was asked was to explain a bit how we produce the annual public health report on climate change. So we started before COVID, and Lambeth had declared climate emergency, and they asked us if we could do anything to inform the citizen assembly on climate change was going to take place. So that's what really triggers us to do the annual.
I just asked Marie, is it possible to speak a bit nearer to your microphone, because it's very quiet? I thought it was just me, but apparently there's other people are hearing it very quietly as well.
Okay.
Sorry.
How can you hear me now?
Not much louder, but oh.
Sorry, can you hear me now?
Oh, that's a little bit better for me. Thank you. Yes.
Is it better? Sorry for that. I will change if you can't hear me in the next 2 minutes. Is it okay?
How other people? Can other people hear properly?
They can't hear properly. Okay.
It's a little bit quiet.
Okay, let me try another way. I'm sorry for that. And it's late. Okay, I will try to without that. Can you hear me now? Okay.
Yes, we can hear you.
Yeah.
Is it better?
Yeah.
Okay. Apology for that. So, I was saying about the production of the APHR. It was a teamwork, definitively. And when I say teamwork, it's not only public health officers, it was people in local authority, especially in air quality and flooding. As I say, the purpose was to inform the citizen assembly on climate change, and we decided to focus on the event of climate change, which will be where the most likely to happen, and also, if they happen, the most serious. And for that, we refer to the London Climate Change Risk Assessment. Then I think the thing that we probably is of interest for you is that we focus on, if I remember well, on flooding, on air quality and heat wave. And for each of them, of course, we review the evidence and the science behind that, but we also focus a lot on vulnerability and vulnerability of our residents and workers to adapt and to mitigate the impact of climate change. And then when we think about what to do, we look at system. And for us, the system is Lambeth, but of course, it's connected to all of the rest of London, and then probably further than that. And we look at what we call interdependencies. So how does the elements of climate change are interdependent, but also how the impact of climate change were also linked to each other. And that linked to the idea of co-benefit when we discuss intervention. Sorry, it changed everything. So, because the second point that we discussed with Maddie was about health inequality. So I explained a bit how we took that. And we started by looking at vulnerability. And for vulnerability to prepare, vulnerability to adapt, vulnerability to recover. And for each of the climate risk, the flooding, the air quality, and the heat wave, we looked at these vulnerabilities, and they are not always the same. They have very much points in common. There are various categories of vulnerability that we identify. The health-related, the socio-economic, the behavior, but also the demography and where you live. So I give you some examples very quickly. So this is around flooding. So flooding, when we look at what was published, vulnerability was associated with susceptibility to the impact, which is age and health. So people were and mental health, and that's very much around the susceptibility, what makes people more sensitive to the impact of having a flooding event. If I have a health condition, if I'm disabled and in an area which is flooded, how do I go away, right? I'm more vulnerable to the impact. Mental health, because, sorry, my computer decided to change. Mental health, because if I have a mental health condition, what we found in the literature is that flooding has a lot of impact on mental health in our country, much more than probably on health and the risk of infectious disease, for example. And then also it's linked how I adapt or how I react depend on my social network around where I live, right? And finally, for example, my income. So in flooding area, we were wondering, and we had some examples very early in the story of Lambeth, but if I don't have the income to pay for my house insurance, and then a flooding happens, I'm really stuck, right? So it was looking at that vulnerability in that sense, looking at the different factors. So around, and this is another example around heat wave, how we look at social socio-spatial vulnerability. So it's the overlap of the mapping, the geographic distribution of the climate risk, and around heat wave it affects everybody, for example, but one of our assumptions, because we don't have local temperature data precise enough, is that we have a heat island effect, right? And if we overlap the areas which we think are more likely to suffer of heat island and the geographic distribution and the socioeconomic distribution of our population, where the most deprived, those with less resources, how does it overlap with the risk of heat island? And I'll give you an example, and that's important for us because not everybody has the capacity to adapt or respond. So I remember I went before COVID to a disability network meeting, and we are discussing heat island because I had the worries that not everybody can implement what we are telling people to do. And I remember this woman who told us that she had a son who is autistic in her 20s, a mom who has dementia, and lived on a, I think it was at the 10th floor. How could she open the window to cross ventilate, right? So it's a very basic element that for us we need to look at, I think. It's also the feasibility to respond to the climate change. And this kind of geography mapping is very useful, we found, for that. We just said, oops. Now, some of the people at the time we were doing the APA charts on a lot of work around trying to map socioeconomic vulnerability as well as the vulnerability to climate events. And that's climate just, right? Just, we are not the only one. A lot of people have been looking at this kind of issue about vulnerability. So just some reflection now about vulnerability and inequality. I think for me, vulnerability is vulnerability to adapt, to respond to a climate event is a result of unequal distribution, right? Not everybody has the same vulnerability. What makes me vulnerable can be associated to health, socioeconomic, or geography where I live. And this is not always equally distributed. Not everybody suffers the same health status. Not everybody has the money in their pocket to adapt or respond. And not everybody is located on raised ground and not along a river, for example. So it's more inequality in a very broad sense. And it's that vulnerability which is not equally distributed. The other thing is that when we speak about inequality, is very, very multidimensional. And I think when we look at climate change events, this vulnerability has some point in common, but some might be very different, right? So if I take the longest example, if the Thames River rise, who is living along the river just now? The people who are able to offer this big, expensive flat, right? Okay, so the vulnerability, the event is there along the Thames, but the people who are living there are not among the most socioeconomically vulnerable. So there is a variability of what is vulnerability and the kind of inequality. The other thing for me is that speaking about inequality, it implies that everybody should have the same thing. Yes, but for that, we need to be equitable. We need to be able to distribute resources according to where the need is the highest. And I like the word equity and equitable outcome because it means that I will allocate resources differently, not in an equal way, but according to where the needs are. And I think when we speak about climate change, vulnerability, that's the implication. Then the other point, which I think will help to address an equitable approach, is what I just mentioned very earlier, is speaking about interdependency and co-benefits. So I didn't include some examples there, sorry for that. But if you think about, we have one, I think, around flooding and SUDS, which is sustainable drainage. And the fact that you have established this can help, of course, avoiding flooding, but also improve mental health because it's more green around, etc. So when we speak about co-benefits, is that it means that with an intervention, we can address several things. And we think that if we focus on co-benefits, then we can address more towards of the inequality because they have all something in common. However, our work, I think now, reflecting after speaking with Mandy, is that we focus a lot on individual vulnerability and inequality. And I think what we haven't included, and we can't do everything, is systematic vulnerability, such as inequitable distribution of economic resources. And that's a system we need to look, not only the individual, is how then I'm sure everybody can pay for a flood insurance for their house is a high risk areas, for example, right? I might be dreaming, but and then just an example of our citizen assembly has started to meet, right? I saw that. I couldn't be involved because I had been dealing with COVID up to now. And I found two recommendations that include just transition. So one is that they are suggesting that research is undertaken to understand how certain groups are affected by change in transport to reduce the emissions. Yeah, so that means being sure that we are making it equitably accessible. And then the second is that they want to establish a team which will just focus on just transition, so taking the word justice into the development of the climate change program. Thank you for listening, and sorry if I rushed.
Oh no, that's excellent. Thank you. That's very inspiring. So just ask, has anyone got any questions, please? Not as of yet. I can't see any questions as of yet, but I must admit, I was just interested to really think about what you had to say about maybe people with disabilities and how they would perhaps cope with travelling and with normal day-to-day activities. It's just one thing that occurs to me is that, just thinking about the day-to-day life anyway could be quite hard if you've got a disability. Sometimes you might be quite dependent on buses, and of course, a lot of traffic around. You just haven't really got much of a choice but to just sit on a bus, which is probably stuck in a traffic jam and everything else. So it's interesting to think a bit more about that and the work that we can do in order to help people with disabilities in order to deal with the situation as it is, as we have got climate change facing us as well as all the other challenges.
Yeah, I think Councillor Rice, I think raising the issue of disability, I think is critical. And what I'm sure you have done that before. I'm sure I'm not inventing anything new. But I remember when we had to cut a lot of budget, what we did is integrated impact assessment. And I'm not thinking about filling up a paper. I'm thinking about an interactive one with the people who are involved and who are concerned by the issue. So if I speak about, you speak about transport for disabled people, I think the first thing is to involve them. And checking and having this, it's not only consultation for me, it's engagement. So around transport, we did something. It was a participatory theatre play, participatory theatre, and it's just a play where you involve people to say how does it finish or how it should evolve. And we did that on air quality, and we did that with our staff. And the first thing which came out is that if there is no safety on the road, don't put me on a bike. Most of the members in the audience had a close contact with someone who had an accident. So what I mean is that we have to find ways that the solution to climate change, we know the science, and that's what COVID shows us. We know the science, we know what needs to be done. But what we don't realize is the feasibility of the intervention. And for that, we need to involve people. I don't know if I responded to your question, sorry.
No, that's really excellent, because sometimes I think that we can sometimes misunderstand what perhaps people with disabilities really what they need. So they always do like to have a say. That's what I think I find with friends that I know who may be in a wheelchair. I mean, they just, we've got the recent Paralympics, and that brings up a whole load of ideas as to how people want to be treated. They just want to be treated like they're just normal members of society, rather than some kind of particular special group for us to patronise in some way. They just want to be living properly along with the rest of us, and so we need to ask them how they can do that. Thank you. So Maddie, you had your hand up.
Thanks, Councillor Rice. Thanks, Marie. That was really, really helpful. What I love about what you said was that the point that you made, where we have to accept that we will need to distribute resources according to need, and that, in order to move forward and get equitable outcomes, we really have to accept that distribution of resources is going to be according to need, and therefore not, even across the population, but very much targeted to those who need it most. And that feeds very well into what we've been discussing in Ealing, and how we do that to get climate justice and health equity is challenging. But you also used a really nice concept of the just transition, and it kind of helps us to think about that's the concept and a phrase that's perhaps very helpful to us here. And you challenge us to think as well about the sort of integrated impact assessments with the environmental impact alongside the health equity impact. So that's really helpful. I also just wanted to ask a quick question, because your colleague in Lambeth shared with us a video, I think, or a link to some experts that spoke to your own Citizens Assembly on climate justice. And I wondered if we were able to share that with the panel for their viewing, and I presume that link is public, if it's okay to share those links with the panel for viewing at a later date, just to see how Lambeth discussed the issue of climate justice after your annual public health report.
Look, I will have to check. I have no idea. Is it Anna who shared that with you?
Yeah, it was Hannah. I believe it's a live link. It was a link to
live
something.
Link. Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. That'll be very helpful. So we'll share that after the meeting. Thanks, Marie.
No, pleasure. I was just going to say about just transit, or so, for example, when we speak about resources and equal distribution of resources to be able to reach equity, the example of adaptation of housing to heat, right, and to air pollution. So, for example, in Lambeth, it's very well known, one of the most polluted areas is Brixton Hill. Who live there? Those we can't afford to pay very much for their rent, and they pay for rent. So if we want to change some things there, to be able to benefit to these people, we have to speak not to them, we have to speak to the landlord. So this is where we need to map all the actors to be able to achieve an equitable outcome. So when we speak about resources, we have to take that into consideration. Yeah, the beneficiary of the resources can be by transition to others before it arrives to the final beneficiary, and that sometimes is tricky, I found.
Thank you. So, Councillor Driscoll.
Thank you, and thank you, Marie, for your presentation. I think there's a lot of commonality between Ealing's. I think the proportionate universality was the expression, and equability of outcome. I think it's all in the same direction of travel. But what I'm trying to sort of look at some tangible and specifics about examples about how we go about this, because a lot of this is very broad brush approach. And I mean, I like the analogy with you can't convince people to move away from cars if they're not feeling safe on the road and they have a direct link with somebody who has been hit on a bike, and it's the most probably persuasive experience, their personal experience and contact. So the urgency and the need to get better infrastructure is apparent there. But I'm trying to understand if this is about justice, how we address individuals or groups of individuals who are less economically advantaged, are challenged and pressured. We've got things like fuel poverty with less insulation, poorer heating systems, whatever, all these things. So I'm looking for some sort of tangible direction of travel and examples of what's happened elsewhere. I know Ealing has actions that it's done, but I'm trying to draw upon other examples that could help us to learn about what we are not doing or what we could do better. And the other thing about this, a lot of it has lots of crossovers between other agencies. I'm talking about flooding, so Thames Water needs to be mentioned. I know my own ward was flooded quite dramatically because of the intensity and the swiftness of rainfall that happened very dramatically, and that will happen again. So we've got infrastructure, so no matter what we do with individuals, it's hard concrete and infrastructure that needs to be changed. And I'm looking at how we pin all this together and looking on a structural infrastructure wide top-down approach with Thames Water and the like, CQC and all of those. And on the other hand, some sort of micro level looking upwards. I'm trying to get both poles of that stick to understand them, if that's understandable, if there's not too many metaphors and analogies coming along there.
Oh, I don't know if I can really address all of that. I think what I take air quality, and it was before we did the APHR. You have to be aware the APHR and Citizen Assembly is taking place now. Mm-hmm. So the decision about, I know that some recommendations are coming out very soon and will be published. And this will be becoming the things that the council and others. So I look at very quickly. There is evidence of, there are some recommendations which is about the councillor leading about change. And then there are also recommendations which is about what the community can do all together. Mm-hmm. Right. If I take air quality, when I started, it's several years now in Lambeth, air quality was nowhere on the, it was air quality. We needed to do something, right? What I think make a tiny bit of difference is when we started to embed air quality in other areas, in planning, in health, and say, wait a minute, you are doing this, what is the impact on air quality? You are doing, so we had, I think with the acute trust, there was a lot of discussion about them, about the ambulance, where do they stay, if they have to really run their engine or not. So I think the council located the electric board to recharge close to the hospital, close to where the ambulance will be setting, etc. That's something I think I heard. So it's how do we, I think, if we're serious about climate change, this needs to be everybody's business and in all departments. So what you mentioned about the big issue of infrastructure will be probably need to be part, of the planning, need to be part and discussed with those who own the infrastructure. That's what I think is that one of the tiny way of approaching and be sure that we make a difference. Sorry.
Yeah. And Chair, if I may, just to look on that sort of micro aspect of like persuading those that maybe have a quite reasonable priority in life of limiting incomes, limited jobs or demanding jobs, and trying to get buy-in to do those small steps at home to insulate better, to think about heating, to drop down 1% on heating. How do we get that message across to get those people to buy in, to make those steps, which cumulatively will have a big difference, but individually seem very small. I wonder if there is any pointers from Lambeth in those aspects.
We discuss a lot about engagement. We discuss a lot about going to people and trying to step in their shoes. And I'll give you an example, which is very close to me because I live in Lambeth. And I was in the street with my neighbor. My neighbor is disabled, has a car, it's his passion, etc. I don't have a car. And they know very well I'm on my bike. And then we had a clash because the car came and asked if I could park. And I say, yes, it's Saturday, but you know, we don't need too many cars. And my neighbor, 2 days after, we are doing some work and we had to consult him. And he was very furious with me to have said that. And you say, Manuel, the council is implementing things, they don't even consult us, right? All this, what you call calm neighborhood, etc. It's good. It's good. It's not good for me. It's all stuck on the main road and I can't move with my car and I need my car. And this stay with me because, and it's very challenging because it's how do we engage all these people? How can we get the agenda on board with everybody, but everybody needs at the end to make a compromise, including us. And that's where I think is the challenge because we can, it's much easier to say, let's put limitations there, let's oblige the children to walk to school, than to engage with a dialogue, which will take time, will mean that the decision around allocating budget are not decided independently of engagement with people, so it delays things. So I believe in it a lot, but I think we need to find out how to make it working here. Sorry, I'm not sure I answer. Very well.
You do bring up a very prescient issue in Ealing at the moment. We call them low traffic neighbourhoods, and I will declare I live in one. So you do bring up a very prescient issue. I won't go down that path because we have a whole meeting on it later on in this schedule of meetings for this panel. But thank you for the illustration.
I don't have all the update about the climate change implementation in Lambeth because of COVID. So, Councillor Rice, I think if your colleague and we are happy, I think, to share because you have also a lot, if I heard, interesting initiatives. So maybe it's a question to arrange. Maybe it's that we exchange queries or questions, yeah, and continue the conversation, not always face to face, but I think there is always a lot to learn from exchanging. And I'm sorry because I don't have all the update from Lambeth.
No, I think it's just excellent to just continue to share because I know the first time that I think I met Jo, who's on the call here, that she was actually speaking at an event in Kensington, I think it was, where there were just a number of people from different councils had come along, and that we were all talking about initiatives, including ones that have been taken by Ealing that have just been absolutely like just really kind of showing such foresight when it came to solar panels on our schools and what we can do about energy, which is very much a hot topic today. Certainly, obviously, we're talking a lot about energy, and we understand that maybe we need to perhaps move away from the natural gas that we're relying on, and let's move on to some other ideas. But that's probably beyond our pay grade here at the council. That's probably something a bit more national. But thank you so much for the input there, Marina. And it's just really helpful and to inspire us. So thank you so much.
Thank you very much for the opportunity.
Yes, and we will continue to talk. Thank you. Right, so yes, so we're supposed to try and sum up really where we are on that, because we have got we've got a meeting coming up on our programme later on about the built environment. But in a sense, it feels like we've already gone through some of that, and because we've been talking a lot about planning, but we just need to really think through. I mean, what impact can we have when it comes to planning, when it comes to infrastructure, when it comes to the homes and the materials, and when it just looks at how we actually just build our whole environment and what we can do in order to improve the situation in terms of the extreme weather conditions that we may well end up facing because of climate change. So we've got so much of that to look at. And very much what comes to my mind has come out of this meeting has been a matter of consultation, talking to people who do have particular needs, because we don't fully understand the situation of those who may be disadvantaged in some way or perceived to be disadvantaged. So shall we talk to them more and see what we can do to help them in terms of the challenges that they're facing in these days of climate change? I mean, just something that we just have to continue to think about. Really, what are the huge impacts that climate change is having, just not only on us in Ealing, but around the world. I mean, it's certainly something to come up with the presentations that we've had. What's going to happen to people in other countries if they end up being forced to find other countries to move to because their own homes just become just too difficult to live in because of climate change. I mean, that has huge impacts as well. I mean, what do we do here in Ealing if we need to help other people who are going to be suffering beyond our imagination, really, where they are in their own homes? And so and also just to continue to think about mental health. It's very much a subject that we need to talk more about. Physical health is something that gets discussed when we talk about the NHS, etc. But now we're talking a lot about mental health and the impacts of the anxiety that has been created by the situations caused by climate change. That is very important. It's very crucial for us to consider that. So I think that's very much something that we need to look into, just in terms of the general well-being of people, within Ealing and beyond. Just to remember, let's continue to plant those trees. We've done so fantastically over the past 4 years. How many have we grown now? How many have we planted? About 37,000 or something at my last count. But let's just continue to grow those trees and plant those trees, because they will help to reduce the heat, and they just will actually do so much for our mental well-being here in Ealing. So there's so much there that we've had to consider and to look at and to work on in terms of how we're going to convince the residents of Ealing to be on board with us and with whatever it is that we do decide to do. So thank you very much there. So on that score, I can probably just look further on to the panel work programme. I don't know if anyone has got anything they'd like to comment on with the work programme that's on the agenda there. Oh, Councillor Driscoll, please.
Yeah, just before we're stepping off the agenda, Miriam, if you don't mind, because I know we're talking about recommendations, and it's very difficult to do it on the hoof in the meeting at this particular moment. But I think some of the points that come out here, it's helpful to get recommendations, and we've got like various things have come up, but it'd be good to, I think, for people to email so we have some sort of draft starting to emerge and people can read it in advance of the next meeting. I just sort of ask members to come together with some sort of recommendations so we have a little bit of thinking from this meeting, because otherwise it's very difficult to do it because of our schedule. I suppose I'm talking about what we've just done and also segueing into the work programme as well. So I'd ask people to come up with, review the agendas and the minutes and come up with some recommendations that can at least be sort of flagged up, not agreed for next meeting, but at least be flagged up and allow people to reflect on over time. So I put that plea because I was chair of the last panel, so it's really important that we get them in advance and people get time to reflect on them. So I suppose I've segued into the work the work programme. And just to go into the work programme, the built environment, I mean, flooding has come up quite a few times, and I just about the role of Thames Water and also our own emergency planning services. I wonder if they can contribute in some way to either the paper or in terms of doing a presentation or something, because I think there is a crossover, especially it's been mentioned about heat and flooding. And we do have a emergency team. And to see what is already being planned, that would be helpful to add into that final meeting.
Thank you for input there, Councillor Driscoll. Yes, that is very helpful. I mean, it's certainly something that's in my mind, that there's so many thoughts that we've all got going on here, and so I'm scribbling away, but I'm sure I won't be able to read my handwriting come the meeting in March, when we will be putting together our recommendations for the year. So hopefully Anna Marie's put some fantastic notes together as well. So so it's probably a good idea if we, while things are fresh in our mind, why we've got it very articulated in our heads, just to just to actually get that typed up and get the email through. That's a very good suggestion, especially bearing in mind your experience on this. So thank you on that one. So I don't know if there's any other comments from anyone else on the work programme. Okay, I can't see any hands up or anything. Just shout at me if I'm missing you, but okay. So in that case, we just perhaps remind the panel that we have got a visit arranged because we did have Capel Manor College come to speak to us last time, and we were just so impressed to see and hear about the work that they're doing in order to prepare people for those green jobs of the future, which are just so important to us. That we'll be, the group of us will be going along to their Gunnersby site on Thursday, the 30th of September at 2 p.m. Those who have already put their names down to attend have been told about the details and where to go and how to prepare for that meeting. So I'm sure there'll be opportunities if anyone else had changed their mind and actually did want to come along to that, because I'm sure it's going to be fantastic and just great to actually see people and get again in person and to discuss the issues that we've been discussing here, but in person. So just to see if there was anything else anyone else wanted to add to that. No. Okay, so I think we're probably in that case probably ready to close the meeting, and just remember that our next meeting is on the 18th of January 2022, and we'll see, we know already that we're looking at the active travel, and we're just looking to do what we can to support the active travel in Ealing and the impact that this has on helping Ealing to achieve its objective of being carbon neutral by 2030. And so we're talking about communication as well to help people cycle more. I've already had someone send me a message to try and maybe add something to that, but I'll have to find out more details about that to see if there's anything more that we can add to that discussion on active travel, which we will very much look forward to. So with that, I'll just have to say thank you very much to everybody. It's just been just such an illuminating evening, and great to have so much feedback and just so much input from you.